Hello, ninth grade students. We're back to Into the Clouds today. And I'm going to begin in chapter 3, page 24, From Another World. For a Himalayan expedition, Houston's party traveled light. Even so, they had 2 tons of food and supplies, all shipped in large tea chests from New York to India. They were tinted snow goggles, down sleeping bags, tents, and coils of rope. There were leather boots with short nails driven through the soles for traction, and spiked attachments known as crampons for kicking footholds into snow and ice. To keep themselves fed on the mountain, they packed dried vegetables, fruit, and powdered milk. They carried hot cereal, canned meats, and biscuits. For the high altitudes, they preserved 50 pounds of pemmican, need to look that word up, pemmican, a high-calorie mixture of dried meat, grain, and raisins used by polar explorers on expeditions to Antarctica and the Arctic. Before they left home, Bob Bates had run the food through tests that sometimes involved more than tasting. To find the perfect kind of biscuits, he dropped them from a second-story window. Then he left them out in the rain for a night. The winning brand had to stand up to moisture without getting soggy, but break into pieces without help from a hacksaw. In India, the men selected extra climbing rope with an equally practical test. They went from shop to shop, picked out rope that looked like the right thickness, and slung a length of it over a ceiling beam. Sensing entertainment, crowds of local boys gathered while the climbers grabbed the rope and hung from it. Most of the selections held Bates and House just fine, but when the brawny Petzolds jumped on, the rope snapped. The 3 of them went sprawling on the floor, sending their audience into hysterics. It took a few tries before they found a rope that would hold all of them. Once they had their gear together, hauling it to K2 was like a major military operation. They had traveled 8,000 miles by ship to Bombay, India, 1,000 miles by train across a desert to Rawalpindi, and 100 miles by truck to the town of Srinagar in the foothills of the mountains. There they split the supplies into 50-pound loads. After one more 18-mile truck ride, they left the luxury of wheels behind for good. They still had 330 miles to go. Ponies carried their gear for the first half of the trek, driven by local men from the region of Baltistan. The caravan slogged through valleys battered by avalanches, snow and rock, and massive tree trunks, all tossed from the peaks above them. Just past the Balti capital of Sarkdu, the terrain grew too rugged for horses. Streetville, the expedition's transport officer, hired 44 porters and pressed ahead. The Balti porters made their way along narrow ledges with 50-pound loads threatening to pull them off. Rivers swollen with meltwater from the mountain peaks raged hundreds of feet below. But climbing high above the rivers was nothing compared to crossing them. As they approached the last village on their route, they came face to face with the infamous Balti rope bridge. The bridges were made from willow twigs braided together into 6-inch thick cables, one for the feet and 2 railings for the hands. These treacherous bridges formed a final gateway to K2, as though they were meant to weed out the unworthy. Houston, Bates, and the rest had heard stories about them. Every mountaineer had. The 2 climbers once flipped a bridge over and dangled above a churning river for several minutes before they could be rescued. Another man was so terrified of the crossing that he had to be blindfolded and carried over by a porter. Rumor had it that the Baltists didn't give the bridges regular maintenance. They waited until each one broke to fix it. Bates stepped onto the trembling ropes, wondering how the last person to reveal a flaw had fared. At every step, the rope contractions squeaked a protest and tremors bounded along the foot cable, he recalled later. He edged along, watching each step to make sure his feet landed squarely on the rope. That, however, made it impossible to ignore the churning water below. One by one, the climbers stepped back onto solid ground, where the porters greeted them with smiles. Most of the Balties had raced across the bridge, even with their 50-pound packs. They must have found it amusing to watch the famed American mountaineers, carrying only small day sacks, inch across the ropes, fearing for their lives. A week later, the expedition trudged up the Godwin-Austen Glacier, a huge pathway of ice covered in snow and fallen rock that weaves through the Karakoram to the doorstep of K2. Low clouds hung over the broad gray surface of the ice. The men plodded along blindly. Suddenly, a window of clear sky opened. A gleaming, ghostly pyramid of snow and ice appeared less than 10 miles away, hanging impossibly high in the sky. It was their first glimpse of the peak they had to climb. Houston and the others stopped in their tracks, stunned. In a moment, the clouds shifted and the mountain was gone, as though it had never existed. To Bates, it was like something from another world, something ethereal, seen in a dream. By June 12th, K2 was more than a dream. It was a solid mass of rock, ice, and snow under the boots of 12 men. The Balti porters had gone home with orders to return in 6 weeks. Their 50-pound loads lay in piles at the foot of the mountain, where the Sherpas and the 6 Sahibs set up their base camp. With their tents pitched, the climbers stared up at the mountain, trying to imagine the route that would unlock its summit. A giant pyramid loomed over them, its sides far from smooth. Huge spurs or ridges ran from the base of K2 nearly to the summit. They stood out like bony spines on a reptile. The ridges looked terrifying. They peaked in knife-edged crests that dropped off thousands of feet to the glaciers below. But those craggy spines were the only safe route up the mountain. Climbers who tried to ascend the low gullies between the ridges invited disaster. The gullies were funnels for giant avalanches, thousands of tons of ice and snow tumbling from the heights faster than a speeding train. So this is a photograph of climbers from the 1939 expedition negotiating the same rope bridges that Houston's team faced in 1938. So that's a picture of that bridge. A ridge it would have to be, but which one? They needed a route free from impossibly steep barriers of rock and ice. A route that would not bury them in avalanching snow. And somewhere on this unyielding mountainside, they needed to find a route with a few places level enough to pitch tents. A mountain as big as K2 couldn't be climbed in a mad rush to the top. The human body needed time to acclimatize, to get used to the changing altitude. That became clear enough in 1875 when 3 French balloonists decided to test their performance at great heights. They soared to 28,000 feet, about the height of K2, in less than 4 hours. When they returned to Earth, 2 of them were dead, their faces blackened from lack of oxygen. The effects of altitude were at least somewhat predictable. The weather was not, and it gave Houston and his teammates another reason to advance carefully. If a storm rolled in, they could be trapped on the mountain for days at a time. To give themselves refuge, they would make a chain of camps up the slope and stock them with supplies by ferrying loads from below. Each camp required a tiny piece of ground flat enough to keep tents from sliding off the mountain. So these are 3 of the expedition's Sherpa climbers watching an avalanche on the west face of K2. So I hope all of you are following along in your book and you're looking at these photographs because they're really amazing photographs. With their strategy clear, Houston, Bates, House, Petzold, Birdsall, and Streetfield split into teams and probed at the mountain. Kikuli and the Sherpas followed in their footsteps with heavy loads on their backs. They had the Duke of Abruzzi's notes to guide them. They had nearly memorized the photos from the wastebasket session, and yet none of it seemed to help. On the northwest ridge, Houston and House ran into a steep 800-foot snow slope with ice an inch beneath the surface. They would have to hack steps into the slope with ice axes at 21,000 feet. One slip and they'd hurtle 4,000 feet down the ridge. Even if they could manage it, it would be too risky for the Sherpas carrying 40-pound loads. A quarter of the way around the mountain, the northeast ridge was no better. Houston, Bates, and Birdsall spied a massive pinnacle. It hung over the upper part of the spur like a guard tower, waiting to drop deadly chunks of ice on anyone who dared attack the ridge. And the south face of the mountain? It was nothing but steep slopes loaded with unstable snow. They'd be buried alive before they made it halfway up. That left the spur the Duke gave his name to, the Abruzzi Ridge, before leaving the mountain in defeat. Houston and House scouted the ridge. It looked climbable, but they saw nowhere to pitch a tent. They did find a few pieces of wood at around 18,000 feet, left over from one of the Duke's crates. It was not far from there that the Duke of Abruzzi had turned around, deciding once and for all that you needed wings to reach the top of K2. A deep depression fell over the camp. June was coming to an end. They'd been on the mountain for 2 weeks, and they were no closer to finding a way up. In their frustration, the team members started to snipe at each other. House was a great climber, but Houston felt he didn't do his share of the work. Instead, House and Petzoltz complained about the food rations. They were sick of corn and hash and kept demanding the pemmican that Houston was saving for the high altitudes. Bob and I are very mad, Houston wrote in his diary on June 22nd, gave them leftover half tin and swore. But on July 2nd, it was Petzold and House who found the expedition's first foothold on the route. They were catching their breath on a tiny snow ledge near the crest of the ridge. Petzold crawled around a rock outcropping to the end of the 60-foot rope that bound him to his partner. House heard a shout and followed. He found Petzoltz looking down on a 20-foot wide shelf of snow cradled against the side of the ridge. It was big enough and flat enough to hold 3 tents, a perfect place to begin their assault on K2. Instantly, our attitude to the mountain changed, House recalled later. With one campsite found, we could find others. So we're going to stop right there on page 34. And tomorrow, hopefully, we'll read all of chapter 4. So thank you so much. Hopefully you're keeping up. If you're not, go back and read. This is a fascinating story. I'm not familiar with this particular expedition to K2, so really excited to see what happens. Thanks so much, 9th graders. Hope you're doing well. Take care.